evening, and thank you all so much for coming to my lecture recital tonight. And I'm going to discuss today the combining of my two favorite universes, the physical universe and the musical universe. The physical universe has always been this tremendous source of wonder and awe and mystery for the entirety of humanity, really, and it's inspired works across all kinds of different artistic mediums. You take science fiction, and you've got Star Wars and Star Trek as just the tip of the iceberg, and then the visual nature is very conducive to visual artworks. But I'm going to talk today about musical composition and its intersection with outer space. So I had two goals in mind when I started this research. One was broad and specific, and the broad one was I just wanted to understand similarities and differences in how composers have explored outer space. And the second one was I wanted to find and analyze a work for solo piano that was inspired by the physical characteristics of some object in the universe. And the piece that I found is called Jupiter's Moons. And I played this one for you just now. And accompanying the piece was real footage of the Juno probe approaching the planet Jupiter, which was it just started orbiting Jupiter in 2016. So that's very recent footage. We couldn't have seen that until 2 years ago. So those were the 4 Galilean moons of Jupiter. And she has a movement that she's written for each of the 4, Europa, Io, Ganymede, and Callisto. And she was inspired by these physical characteristics of the moons in a significant way. And I'm referencing Judith Zaimont, who is a living composer, who's also one of the most important American composers of the last few decades. She's got a huge repertoire that she's written, and she also has won many awards, and she was also a Guggenheim Award winner. So very prominent composer. She also has retired now, and she lives in northern Arizona. Okay. So when I studied all of these works based on astronomy, I had the same process for each of them. First, I wanted to know what the inspiration was behind it. I wanted to know the nature of that inspiration. And then once I found it, I wanted to know how the inspiration manifested itself in the pitches or the rhythms or just some aspect of the music that was composed. Okay, so here's an example. The most famous work based on astronomy is The Planets by Gustav Holst, and when you listen to movements of the planets, it calls to mind the planets, such as Mars. You think of probably the Red Planet. The Tucson Symphony Orchestra a couple of years ago even had a performance where they synced up the music with footage of the planets. Okay, so here's Mars. CDs released by orchestras such as the Berlin Philharmonic and the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. They'll also have the planets in their physical form on their albums. However, Holst's primary inspiration for the work wasn't actually the planets themselves. On the contrary, the piece was inspired by the astrological characters associated with the planets. For example, Mars is the bringer of war. These are the entire titles of the planets. Mercury is the winged messenger, Saturn is the bringer of old age, and Uranus is the magician. Holst was actually an avid astrologer, and he cast the horoscopes of his friends in his leisure time. Okay? In his book, Holst the Planets, Richard Green writes this: Holst's insistence on astrological cues, in spite of many reviewers' stress on an astronomical point of view, was a means of emphasizing the human aspect. Holst speaks of astrological significance, not the character of each planet. Here's a cool transition. So take, for instance, Mars, the bringer of war. The association of Mars and war goes back to ancient Greece, when they would see a red planet and associate it with blood spilled in battle. Okay. Now we know today that the redness of Mars comes from a layer of oxidized iron dust on the surface. So the association of Mars and war has no physical basis. It has no basis in terms of physical reality. So there's a lot of pieces in the same vein as this, which are inspired by mythological associations based on these ancient cosmologies. These works are very special and important to the repertoire. So this picture here was first seen in ancient Greece, and I think it sums this up a little bit. It also came back later in a textbook by a professor named Flammarion in 1888. And this person is imagining an infinite universe. It was thought for most of our history that the universe was just a finite dome of stars, stars as a backdrop, and that there was nothing else behind that. So this person is imagining the beyond. Also relevant is we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe until 1600, and we thought the Sun was the center after that until the early 20th century, when we had modern cosmology come into the fold. Okay, so as modern cosmology has advanced over the past century, a new type of astronomy-based work has become possible, by and large, because of one specific human achievement, and that is space exploration. Knowledge that we've garnered from space exploration makes up most of what we know about the solar system, and therefore it's very relevant when making considerations about what possible influences composers of astronomy-based works could have had. For instance, the piece I'm playing today, Jupiter's Moons, couldn't have been titled Jupiter's Moons until 1610 because it hadn't discovered the moons yet. And then it couldn't have really made anything further than a shallow reference to the moons of Jupiter until the 1970s, because all we knew about the probes was their existence and location up until the 70s. So, because these probes are relevant to the piece, let's take a look at what they've discovered here. This probe was the first to take photographs of Jupiter, and then it blazed a trail for Voyager, which was the first to discover facts about the moons of Io, including that the moons of Jupiter, including the fact that Io has volcanoes and a lot of volcanic activity, and Europa has an ocean of liquid water underneath its surface. At the time Lang Zaimont was writing this work that I'm going to play, there was a probe orbiting around Jupiter that NASA had in orbit there. And it discovered that the largest moon, Ganymede, had a magnetic field large enough to have its own magnetosphere, which generates positive and negative ions at the poles of the moon and can create auroras when the sunlight hits the poles. And so you have the northern lights of Earth, yes, but you also have the northern lights of Ganymede. So, why is this relevant? Well, it wasn't until these probes provided discoveries of specific aspects of the moons that Judith Lang Zaimont's composition became a possibility. No piece prior to these probes could have suggested, for instance, the volcanic activity of Io, because the surface features of Io were not yet known. Pieces such as Lang Zaimont's are going to form a group of works in my classification system that I've named scientific-based works. The defining characteristics will be that the composer possessed knowledge of the physical object, the physical characteristics of the object to which they allude. So having highlighted this importance of the composer's specific inspiration and showed how it can be somewhat misleading in the case of the Holst planets, and then highlighted the importance of modern cosmology and space exploration, I'm going to turn to my classification system. And most astronomy-based works, I found, have neither been inspired by scientific understanding, nor intended to make explicit musical suggestions of the phenomena that they reference. Rather, the primary inspirations for these works were non-scientific. So to better understand this diversity, I did categorize these works into 4 different types: mythological, subjective, aleatoric, and scientific. So let's dive in here. Mythological works are inspired by cultural myths associated with the night sky, and they typically stem from belief systems of cultures which thrived before modern cosmology. So examples are the planets, for instance, the association between Mars and war, additionally Jupiter and love, because the Greeks and Romans believed the planets to be gods and goddesses in possession of human traits and virtues. So there are quite a few works that fell into this category. It was the predominant category in terms of works. A couple more, in addition to the planets, are The Sons of Light by Ray Vaughan Williams. And this is the 3-movement work. The first movement is inspired by ancient Greek legends. The second movement is inspired by the Chinese zodiac. And the last movement is inspired by the Christian creation myth. And then Macrocosmos by George Crumb is inspired by the Chinese zodiac. The first volume of this has 12 movements, as there are 12 constellations in the zodiac. And I put in yellow here the subtitle at the end. So written in the stars for me is this first movement, because I am Cancer. And my sister, an avid astrologer as well, will be interested in the 6th movement, because she's a Sagittarius. Okay, subjective works. In subjective works, the composer finds inspiration in their own personal experience of engaging with the night sky. And it's often in the moment. You know, they're either looking at the stars with the naked eye, or they're looking through a telescope at something. And I've got an example of both here. The Comet at Yellon is actually a poem by Thomas Hardy that Gerald Finzi set to music in 1933. And it's less about the comet itself, and more about how the light of the comet shows the beauty of the narrator's lover on a hillside. A Starlit Dome is based on composer John Pickard's feeling when he looked at the Orion Nebula through a telescope. That is the Orion Nebula right there. So here's an example, here's a quick 30 seconds of the Comet at Yellon. Going back to the Starlit Dome, the composer, John Pickard, says this about the piece on his website. This piece tries to reflect something of how I feel about such phenomena. It begins quietly and mysteriously, slowly coming into focus. Gradually, the pace quickens and the activity increases, the music becoming louder and more virtuosic, until at the end it is bursting with energy. Works which make use of chance or otherwise random procedures to inform the musical content will be classified as aleatoric works. These works are characterized by an incidental process of composition, which could be done by someone who doesn't compose. So, a couple of examples. John Cage in Etude Astral, he used a southern sky, star charts of the southern sky atlas to plot themes for a collection of piano works. Piano music. And then The Harmony of the World is an example of visual, audio representations of astronomical data. And a lot of times what people will do is they take the vibration frequencies of objects in the universe and they convert it to audio frequencies, and then they transpose it into an octave that the human ear is able to hear. So here's a bit of the John Cage. this piece aleatoric because if he'd had just had an atlas of the northern sky, it'd sound different. And if he'd have explained the process he used exactly to someone else, they'd have come up with the same thing, provided they used the same star charts. Okay, the last category. Works attempting to portray or otherwise suggest objective characteristics of the phenomena will be classified as scientific, what I alluded to a bit earlier. For such works, knowledge of the object or objects of inspiration is essential for the composer to write the work. A couple examples here. Edgar Varèse's ionization isn't an astronomy-based work, but it fits the scientific category so well that I wanted to include it. It's based on the process of atoms gaining or losing electrons, which makes them ions. So that's what he's portraying there. And then the Cosmic Trilogy by Guillaume Conson is a set of 3 works. And it was inspired by significant moments in the timeline of the universe, including the birth of light after the Big Bang and the death of stars by way of supernovae. Here is his kind of self-proclaimed attempt to portray a supernova in this quote right here. For scientific works of the last category, it's really important to consider whether or not there are fundamental similarities between the physical universe and the musical universe. If there aren't any, then I really can't justify comparisons in my analysis. Okay, so what are these connections if there are one? The most important one is the sense that both the physical universe, objects in the physical universe, and pieces of music appear to move forward through time. So there's this analogy of motion. All right. So Edward Hanslick was a critic, music critic in the 19th century, and he wrote an essay about the representational capabilities of music, and it was quite skeptical actually. But he admits here in this quote, motion being analogous in both. And not only just motion, but also gradations and nuances in motion as seen at the end of this quote here. And to give you a demonstration of this ability to rise and fall in the speed or the energy of motion, I've synced up a visualization of 2 neutron stars colliding with an excerpt from the Mahler Symphony. And what you're going to hear is, as the stars orbit each other and get closer together, they will speed up and there will be an increase in energy. And the same thing is going to happen in the Mahler. There's going to be a crescendo and an increase in the surface rhythmic activity. And then suddenly in both there will be a huge explosion in the case of the stars, and there will be a huge forzando in the Mahler, and it's going to be very drastic and a very huge increase of intensity. And then they will both die down at the same rate. So the energy will decrease and dissipate. So just to recap this classification system, mythological works are inspired by associations with outer space based on ancient belief systems. Subjective works are inspired by how a composer felt in the moment, or just the human aspect of interacting with outer space. Aleatoric works are random works and based on chance procedures to generate the pitches. And then scientific works are inspired by the characteristics of the object that the piece alludes to. Now the piece I'm going to play, I want to be clear on the classification here. It's both mythological and scientific. This classification system is not mutually exclusive. when I had a telephone interview with Zaimont, she was nice enough to agree to interview by telephone, and she would answer my emails. So she said this in the interview. She wrote with all the scientific information she could get her hands on, and then she knew the mythology in mind. So both of these play an important role in the piece. In the program notes of the work, there's a paragraph dedicated to the mythological aspects that inspired her and the scientific aspects that inspired her. To stay true to the nature of this research, I'm just going to focus on the scientific aspects of my analysis. So, the second movement of the suite, and the second closest Galilean moon to Jupiter, is Europa. This moon is what we call highly differentiated. Differentiation refers to how clear one layer of the planet's composition flows into the other. And this is a very highly differentiated moon. So the layer of ice on the top clearly goes to the subterranean ocean underneath that, clearly goes into the rocky interior, and then clearly goes into the metallic core. So there's 4 layers. Very clear. It's like a good cake on the British baking show. There's clear layers. This is going to influence Zaimont. I want to tell you one more cool thing about Europa first. There are red streaks all over the planet's surface, and it's from water underneath the icy surface coming up through the cracks. And in the water are these hydrated salts, thought to be made of magnesium sulfate or sulfuric acid. So that's how they get the reddish hue there. So when I spoke to Zaimont about this piece, she made it very clear what was her inspiration. She said this: she was affected by the layers of the satellite itself during the composition. She's referring to the differentiation, the clarity of the layers. So she opted for a piece, she said this, it was as foursquare as she could possibly write. And she insisted to me that she never would have written music like this if she didn't know it was Europa she was writing about. So inspired by the clear layers of Europa's composition, Zaimont's movement is also highly differentiated. So to accomplish this, she provides clarity of structure to certain elements of the piece, particularly the tonality, the meter, and the register. In comparison to the other movements of the suite, the tonality and meter are clearly defined, or as Zaimont would have called it, foursquare. Additionally, as we're going to see, the pitches are spaced out quite evenly across the 4 registral octaves of the keyboard. And something she's also going to do here is the clarity of the layers is going to make her write a very traditional piece. She's going to analogize clarity to being very traditional. So with the tonal structure, it's very traditional in the sense, in comparison to the rest of her movements. So I asked her why she used D Lydian, and she said this: it is as close to traditional music and traditional anything as I can get. I wanted it to be super major, and that's what the Lydian mode does. The primary motive of this piece is showing off that Lydian sharp 4, the G sharp there. And then she has very stable chords on the downbeats of 1 and Lydian 5. That provides a lot of structure to the piece. And then to add on to that, she has a pedal tone in the bass. So she's trying to make everything clearly defined from the get-go. And then she repeats this theme. There's several more iterations. Here's 2 more in the keys of B and C. I'm going to play the top one here. Meter. In any instances during Jupiter's moons, Zaimont removes the listener's sense of meter to enhance the mystery and the uncertainty in the piece. For instance, the first and third movements are largely unspecified. The majority of Callisto and Ganymede are made up of sections with a clear pulse. But the time signatures are mostly made of parentheses, mostly inside of parentheses, suggesting that the performer shouldn't feel the overall meter. The meter is de-emphasized in that way. The number of beats in a measure also changes very frequently in Io as well as Ganymede and Callisto. Comparatively, the meter in Europa is very grounding. It's always clearly defined both notationally and aurally, as many downbeats feature rich chords, as you just saw. There are several tempo changes, however, the pulse is never divided further than the quarter note, and the half note predominates 87% of the time, which is much more stable than the more volatile Io, for instance, which almost exclusively uses an eighth note pulse. I asked Lynn Zaimont about register in this piece, and she said that register in general is something that is central in my way of conceptualizing. When I asked her about the register in Europa, she explained to me that the layers inspired her to use a more confined, traditional, again, layout. This reference to traditional refers to the registral spans of earlier keyboard instruments, which would be confined within fewer octaves, about 4 octaves. Definitely not the 7 that we've got today in the modern piano. And she uses pitches in these 4 registral octaves here almost exclusively. You can see there's just over 1,000 pitches in Europa, and I made a map of where they were at, and you can see how she is using these 4 octaves of choice here. There's 62 notes in the 6th registral octave, but this mostly happens in one theme, so it could be even fewer than that. Now there's one other way that she uses register, and she stratifies the melody. So take a look at this. We've got the soprano melody in red, and then the alto in blue, the tenor in brown, and then the bass in orange. And what you can hear is an aural differentiation. So we're going back to that concept of the clear layers of the planet, the clear layers of the melody she puts forth here. Here's one example. Here's another one where you'll be able to hear one melodic layer end and another one begin. And the alto, tenor, and bass have a similar motive here, so it's possibly more clear in this one. I'm going to start just from the red circle. So to recap, the defining influence for Zaimont in this piece is the clear layers, the differentiation of the moon's composition. So what she does is she has a clear structure in the elements of tonality and meter, and then in the register she stratifies the melody so that she has clear layers there, and then she uses the 4 registral octaves as a way of being more traditional, which she analogizes to a more clear structure. Okay. closest to Jupiter. Io is slightly larger than Earth's moon and is tidally locked with Jupiter as the moon is to Earth. So if you lived on Jupiter, you would only see one side of Io. It would be a dark side of Io. So there are 3 huge moons on the other side of Io, and Jupiter on the one side. So this creates just a massive amount of tidal friction. So Io is the most geologically active moon in the entire solar system, the most active body in the solar system. And it's got over 400 volcanoes here, and from many of them, plumes of sulfur and sulfuric dioxide can shoot out up to several hundred kilometers. So because of all of this chemical and matter falling back on the planet's surface, the surface age is always relatively young, and it's constantly changing between various shades of yellow, red, white, black, and green through the sulfuric compounds and allotropes. Musically, the piece Io is unique to the others in my analysis. This was the first piece composed in the suite, and it was actually composed before the suite was named Jupiter's Moons. So unlike the other 3 I'm going to analyze, the moon was not the driving conception during the compositional process. Rather, it was actually the nature of the piece that dictated the eventual title. The resemblances between the physical properties of Io and Zaimont's corresponding movement are evident on both a large and a small scale. So of Io, Zaimont explained her desire for something that would not agree, and she elaborated that the hands would be far apart in different touches. You had the legato in the right hand and the staccato in the bass. She insisted that the whole movement needed to be unsettled. So in this movement, she's going to reflect the unsettled nature of the tidal and volcanic activity. And she's going to do it through the use of tonality, meter, and articulation. As with Europa, comparison of Zaimont's use of meter in Io with the other movements of the suite reveal congruency with the moon that it suggests. The overall pulse is felt at the 8th note, and the piece has 10 different time signatures with 3 different subdivisions of the beat, which produces a metric volatility consistent with the geological activity of the moon. So the most significant evidence of metric volatility is shown in this graph right here, which highlights the 58 tempo changes in 86 total measures. This graph. Yeah, that was my reaction as well. That's 2/3 of the measures have a new time signature. That was just the reaction I wanted when I said that. Whoever that was, thank you very much. Like the ever-changing surface of the moon, the tonality of Io remains in a state of continuous fluctuation. Zaimont provides no key signature, and the predominant right-hand material consists of each melody note being accompanied with a triad, which, if you take them together, they're not suggestive of a single key. For instance, the opening excerpt here begins with a G minor triad in second inversion, and then moves to an F minor triad in first inversion, which, if you take these together, they could be suggestive of E flat major or C natural minor. The next chord is F sharp minor in first inversion, which couldn't fit in either of those keys. To muddle this tonal landscape further, the next chord is not even a triad, and then the one after is an enharmonic E flat minor triad, and then after that there's 2 chords that suggest G major. So harmonically this is all over the place. It sounds like this. She also muddles the tonal landscape with the use of chromatic neighbors, both harmonically and melodically. In measures 14 and 15, the melody note begins on a G sharp as the chordal third of an E major triad, and then it steps down to a G, working as the root of a minor triad. the harmonic relationship of the next two chords, D and D flat major, is also a chromatic neighboring. And then the subsequent two chords of F and F sharp minor are chromatic neighbors, both melodically and harmonically. Measures 29 and 30 demonstrate Zaimont's seemingly conscious choice to alternate back and forth between sharp and flat harmonies. So here, sharp chord E major moves again to flat chord G minor, and then the stepwise ascent begins with another sharp chord, and then there are three flat chords after that, and then it jumps down to a fourth before raising up again to two more sharp chords. So this rapid fluctuation, along with the incessant chromaticism that you see in these three examples, and the ambiguous tonal relationships between the triads, creates this multicolored harmonic landscape which is reminiscent of Io's surface. The other important element of the unsettled character in this piece is the articulation. Recall that Zaimont insisted that the hands be in different touches. Throughout the piece, the left hand is mostly staccato, while the right hand is smooth legato. Additionally, the hands play different roles. Now, the right hand provides both the melodic and the harmonic content, which is quite rare, which leaves the left hand to kind of disrupt the phrases of the right hand, with what Zaimont referred to as interpolations. And measures 10 and 11 here contain the first such interpolations. And notice the tempo marking en relievo sempre, which indicates that the left hand should always stand out when it's played. Additionally, the interpolation causes this metric shift to a 16th pulse with an uneven number of beats, creating further instability. Here's two more examples of interpolations. And the thing that you notice about them is that there's a bunch of intermittent rests, there's large leaps, and they're really short rhythmic values. So they really can't be confused as being something melodic because of this. I'm going to play the top one here only. Here's one more example. This is the climactic interpolation. It's the only other measure which moves to a 16th pulse, like the first example you saw. And the left hand is entirely accented staccato as well. So she uses an interpolation as the climax. I'll start from the beginning of this picture. So to summarize, this piece was written before she decided the themes of the pieces, which is different than the other three. Recall that she wrote with all the scientific information she could get her hands on, with the exception of this one. Because this one, the nature of it drove the eventual title, because the similarities between the piece and the moon are so similar. You have the kind of chameleon-like harmonies, which reflect the chameleon-like surface with all the volcanic activity, always changing the surface of the moon. And then the 2/3 measures tempo changing is also volatile, like the interior. And then you've got these left-hand interpolations and different touches. So just in the way that the gravitational pull on one side disagrees with the gravitational pull on the other side, Jupiter with the three larger moons. Now the right hand and the left hand provide this unsettling quality. Additionally, Zaimont said that the piece is supposed to be very dry in terms of pedaling. And this moon is the driest body in the solar system, the least amount of water. So we also have the driest movement for the driest moon. Ganymede is the second farthest Galilean moon from Jupiter, and among all of the moons in the solar system, it's the largest one, and it has the most mass as well. It's actually larger than Mercury, and it has, as mentioned before, a magnetic field which is large enough to have its own magnetosphere, and it's the only moon in the solar system for which this is the case. I already mentioned that it had auroras as well. All of these photos that you're seeing are from the NASA photo archive, so they likely came from one of the probes I mentioned before, or possibly the recent Juno probe, which is currently orbiting Jupiter. A lot of times the images are adjusted so they look clearer and more awesome. Mention the auroras. Of this movement, Zaimont noted that Ganymede's magnetism certainly may be felt in the pull of each fragmented phrase, maybe trying to escape back to the moon's surface. This quote reveals not only that the moon's magnetism is a central inspiration to her conception of the movement, but also the way in which she conceives of the magnetism within a musical framework. Specifically, it implies a musical agent attempting to escape from Ganymede's service, and then a convergence when the escape attempt ends in failure. She appears to go one step further in her portrayal of Ganymede's magnetism by including several passages of a certain shimmering quality high in the register of the piano, which is a similar description you would give in an aurora. It's high above and it shimmers. So when a larger magnetic object begins to attract a smaller one, the force of the attraction increases as the two objects get closer together. And this means that they accelerate towards one another instead of going the same speed. So this acceleration is going to play a role in what she does compositionally, both in her phrasing, her tempo choices, and her register, and dynamics as well. Here's measures 5 through 10, two different examples. And she's going to use this idea of musical acceleration in the speed that the piece goes. So you can see that she marks its start hesitantly at the beginning. And then she says gradually up to tempo. So gradually is the key word there. You're going faster over time, just as you join up together faster over time. I'm going to play the bottom one only. She also uses register to suggest a magnetic convergence. Here the bass moves up a total of an augmented fourth, and then the top voices move an octave or more. So in this sense, the smaller object is the top voices because they're moving farther, and the larger object is the bottom voice. Here's this example. Bars 15 and 16, I think she suggests magnetic convergence through her dynamics as well. Dynamics really lend themselves well to this concept of acceleration because anytime you have a crescendo or a decrescendo, you're supposed to gradually do your increase or decrease in dynamics. The subito markings here could be a all of a sudden beginning of a magnetic convergence, and then the crescendos here as they get closer together. This example. The musical agent attempting to escape is evident when analyzing the direction of the phrases throughout the movement. In my analysis, I counted every slur in the pieces of phrase, even if it was just 2 notes, which was quite rare, only 2 out of 40. 92% of all the phrases ascended. 82% ended on the highest pitch in the phrase. 72% still began on the lowest pitch and ended on the highest pitch. And now this is quite shocking. Almost half of the measures increased by 2 octaves or more from the first note to the last. So there's a huge ascension. And this is the musical agent trying to escape the magnetism. So here's an example of this in the score. Here's 7 on this one page. All of these slurs are increasing 2 octaves or more. There's also this recurring motive in Ganymede with these rapidly alternating 16th notes high in the register, and I mentioned that this suggests auroras. There's one that happens right at the beginning, and I'm about to play the movement, so I won't play this example. Just listen for it at the beginning. But just to recap, the essential inspiration to Zaimont's movement here, in the scientific sense, is the magnetism of this planet being so great. And she's not only thinking of convergence of magnets, as there is acceleration when they converge, which she does in her tempo and her dynamics and her register, but she's also thinking that there's an agent trying to escape the magnetism, and that's why all the phrases are ascending. And then the possible aurora motive as well, which happens a couple of times. Certain of these craters are bright compared to the rest of the moon, most notably Valhalla, which is pictured above here. So unlike the neat differentiated composition of Europa, Callisto is believed to be partially differentiated. In other words, Callisto's constituents began to separate from each other in a direction towards what Europa became, but the process was never completed. It failed. So above is a model of how the core might look, with an icy outer shell subterranean saltwater ocean, and a muddled interior of metal, rock, and ice. So the inactive and undeveloped character of Callisto is reflected in the beginning of Zaimont's corresponding movement. This movement begins with an extended, slow introduction in which Zaimont lays out the main theme of the eventual rondo, and this is how she describes laying it out, against a completely indistinct background, using the pedals to let the music be clouded. Reinforcing this artistic idea, Zaimont marks the beginning of the piece murky inward. Zaimont uses a combination of pedals, rhythmic spacing, and register to achieve the cloudiness in the introduction section of Callisto. Together, these elements blur the tonality, meter, and even the underlying pulse, allowing for comparisons to Callisto's partially differentiated core. For the introduction, Zaimont indicates that the performer should hold the following cluster with the sostenuto pedal. The cluster contains 8 pitches, spans an augmented octave, and is mostly located in the 3rd registral octave of the piano. The cluster is held through most of the first 2 pages of the piece, the entirety of the slow introduction. There are several areas with multiple beats of rest, where, because of this cluster, you can still hear sounds ringing, so the murkiness of the sound lingers on. And along with this pedal, the damper pedal is employed to create a clouded, murky soundscape. Notice here in the following examples how Zaimont indicates that the performer should pedal through unorthodox intervals low in the register. For instance, bar 18, right here, the right hand plays 4 harmonic intervals between A flat 2 and C4, and the pedal blends all of the 8 pitches together. Measure 20, Zaimont indicates to pedal a similar right-hand passage, while also adding 2 melodic second intervals in a row for the bass. Measure 21 indicates that the performer should pedal through semitones in both hands on different occasions. Along with this, the sostenuto cluster is always being held in the background. She also clouds the listener's sense of rhythmic pulse in the introduction through a combination of thin texture and large gaps within the notes. So the symbol at the beginning indicates that the meter is unspecified, and the first phrase contains several chords with rhythmic values exceeding a quarter beat. Then the right hand has this diverging idea, which she follows with a fermata, and then caesuras, and then 3/4 rests. So the space that she uses in this first system, which continues throughout the introduction, deprives the piece of enough forward motion to get off of the ground. In this sense, it mirrors both the dead quality of the mood, as well as the partial differentiation of the core. It's clear that an idea is forming, but it could fall short. So Zaimont said this in the introduction: the whole thing is going to cohere, but it takes a while for it to get up there to something much brighter. Measures 12 and 14 have an elongated monophonic texture in the very low register, much in the same way that Callisto's interior lost the momentum to achieve the full differentiation. This passage loses energy as the tempo gets slower and the dynamics get softer. Adding the fermati at the end, Zaimont gives the impression of a musical agent sputtering out and not completing its objective. the most notable parallel between the moon's features and the introduction is the use of extremely low register. So here's another register map containing Callisto's pitches this time. All 408 pitches played while the Sostenuto cluster is being held down, including the pitches of the Sostenuto cluster. With 84% of the pitches coming in below middle C, it can be concluded that Zaimont's use of low register to suggest dead, distant, cloudy, murky, and inactive Callisto was the intention. Because the human ear is able to hear more overtones of lower notes, her choice is grounding both in terms of physics and human physiology. Now, if we compare the registral maps of both Callisto and Europa, it confirms Zaimont's insistence of the importance of register and her conceptualization of the movements within the suite. So to recap, this moon is the opposite of both Io and Europa. Io in the sense that it has basically no geological activity, and Europa in the sense that the layers never were clearly defined. The cake on the British baking show had horrible layers for Callisto. And this piece is going to be murky at the beginning because of that influence. So the tones, the pitches you will hear are all lower, the notes you'll hear are all below middle C, and the pedals will blend them together. And then there's going to be a lot of spaces. You wouldn't be able to tap a beat to the beginning of this. to play the last movement, Leda, right now. Now, Leda is also a moon of Jupiter, but it's much, much smaller and less significant, if you will. It's almost the size of an asteroid, and it's not large enough to be spherical.
With a video of the current Juno probe